In 1671, King Charles II of England was served a dish so exotic, so impossible, that he immediately banned anyone else from having it. He gave his royal ice cream maker a lifetime pension of $20 per year, equivalent to $50,000 today, just to keep the recipe secret. This wasn't some magical delicacy from distant lands. It was ice cream. Frozen, creamy, perfectly smooth ice cream. Served in the middle of summer, 300 years before anyone had a freezer. But here's what historians don't want you to know. People have been making ice cream for over 2,000 years. Ancient Romans were eating flavored ice desserts when London was still a swamp. Chinese emperors had frozen milk desserts in 200 BC. Medieval Arabs were making sherbet with techniques we've completely forgotten. They didn't just make it for special occasions. By the 1700s, common people in Naples were eating ice cream on the streets daily. George Washington spent $200 on ice cream in the summer of 1790 alone. That's $6,000 in today's money. Thomas Jefferson had his own ice cream recipe that required 18 steps and took 3 days to make. How did they do it? How did they freeze cream in July heat? How did they make it smooth without electric mixers? How did street vendors keep it frozen all day without refrigeration? The answer involves underground ice caves, poisonous salt mixtures, servants who stirred for 6 hours straight until their hands bled, and a secret network of ice smugglers who were more powerful than drug cartels. Before we dive into these mind-blowing ancient techniques that made the impossible possible, make sure you're subscribed with notifications on. We're revealing the most insane, forgotten methods of history every week. Hit that subscribe button now, because after learning how your ancestors made ice cream in the desert, you'll never look at a cone the same way again. The story begins in ancient China, 200 BC. Workers were mixing snow with saltpeter, potassium nitrate, creating a chemical reaction that dropped temperatures to minus 20 degrees Celsius. They weren't just cooling things. They were creating artificial winter. But they discovered something even more incredible. When you mixed this supercooled salt with snow and placed a container of flavored milk inside it, the milk didn't just freeze, it transformed into something creamy and smooth. They called it frozen milk flour. The secret was constant motion. Chinese servants would roll sealed containers back and forth for hours, never letting the freezing milk rest. This prevented ice crystals from forming. The result was a texture impossible to achieve by simple freezing. But here's what's disturbing. The servants who made this dessert rarely lived past 40. The saltpeter wasn't just cold, it was toxic. Prolonged exposure caused what Chinese medical texts called the frost disease, likely severe arthritis and nerve damage from both the cold and chemical exposure. The Chinese kept this secret for nearly 1,000 years. Then in 1295, something changed. Marco Polo returned from China with something more valuable than silk or spices, the method for making frozen desserts. But the formula he brought back had been altered. The Chinese had given him a safer but less effective version. The Italians became obsessed with perfecting it. By the 1500s, Florentine alchemists were experimenting with different salt and ice mixtures. They discovered that regular salt mixed with ice created an endothermic reaction. It absorbed heat so rapidly that it could freeze liquids in minutes, but they needed ice. Lots of ice, in Italy, in summer. This is where things get crazy. Beneath the major Italian cities were vast underground ice storage systems, the neviere. These weren't simple cellars. They were elaborate underground cathedrals carved from solid rock, some going down 30 meters. The walls were lined with straw and volcanic ash for insulation. The temperature stayed at exactly 0 degrees Celsius year-round. Every winter, armies of workers would harvest ice from the mountains. They had exactly 48 hours to transport it to the cities before it melted. The ice harvest employed 50,000 people across Italy. It was the fourth largest industry after agriculture, textiles, and wine. But harvesting mountain ice was deadly work. In 1689, an avalanche killed 200 ice harvesters in a single day. The families weren't even compensated. Ice harvesting was considered voluntary despite being the only winter work available for the poor. The ice was packed in massive blocks, each weighing 300 pounds. Workers who slipped while carrying them were crushed instantly. The death rate among ice carriers was higher than among soldiers. Once stored, the ice became more valuable than gold. Ice merchants controlled entire neighborhoods. They had private armies. Ice theft was punishable by death. In 1654, 2 men were executed in Rome for stealing 50 pounds of ice, worth more than a house at the time. But storing ice was only half the battle. Making ice cream required another secret: the mantecatore. The mantecatore was a specialized craftsman who knew the exact technique for turning cream into ice cream. They were more closely guarded than royal jewelers. Each mantecatore had their own secret method, passed down through families for generations. The process was brutal. The cream mixture was placed in a metal container, which was then submerged in a larger bucket filled with ice and salt. The mantecatore would stir continuously with a wooden paddle called a spadella for 4 to 6 hours without stopping. Stop for even a minute, and ice crystals would form, ruining the texture. The mixture had to be stirred at exactly the right speed. Too fast and it wouldn't freeze, too slow and it would become grainy. The mantecatore could tell by sound alone when the ice cream was ready. It made a specific whisper against the paddle. Their hands would go numb after the first hour. By the 3rd hour, they couldn't feel their arms. Many mantecatore developed permanent nerve damage, their hands frozen in a claw shape from gripping the paddle. But there was an even darker secret to making perfect ice cream. The best ice cream makers added something to their salt mixture that they never wrote down: sal ammoniac, ammonium chloride. This created temperatures of -40 degrees Celsius. It could freeze cream in minutes instead of hours. But sal ammoniac was incredibly dangerous. It released ammonia gas when mixed with water. Ice cream makers worked in unventilated cellars filled with toxic fumes. They called it the devil's breath. Prolonged exposure caused blindness, lung damage, and madness. In Venice, there was a guild of ice cream makers who all lived on the same island. By age 50, most were blind or insane from ammonia exposure. The island became known as l'Isola dei Pazzi, the island of madmen. The French took ice cream to another level of insanity. In 1660, the chef Francesco Procopio dei Coltelli opened Café Procope in Paris, the first establishment to sell ice cream to the public. But his ice cream was different. It was smooth as silk, lighter than air. His secret? Eggs. Hundreds of them. Procopio's recipe required 100 egg yolks per batch, whipped for 3 hours by hand until they tripled in volume. The eggs were mixed with cream that had been boiled and cooled 7 times, each time skimming off impurities. The process took 18 hours. But here's the insane part. Procopio discovered that adding alcohol, specifically amaretto, prevented the ice cream from freezing solid. It stayed creamy even at freezing temperatures. This was revolutionary, but it meant his ice cream was essentially an alcoholic dessert. Nobles would get drunk on ice cream. King Louis XIV became so addicted to Procopio's ice cream that he ate it 3 times a day. His doctors warned it would kill him. They were right. Historians now believe his chronic stomach problems and eventual gangrene were caused by contaminated ice cream. The lead-lined pewter containers used to freeze it were slowly poisoning him. By the 1700s, ice cream had spread to the American colonies, where they faced an even bigger challenge: no mountains for ice, brutal summers, and no ancient ice storage systems. The Americans invented something incredible: the icehouse pyramid. These structures were architectural marvels. Built partially underground, they had double walls filled with sawdust, charcoal, and crushed oyster shells for insulation. The interior was lined with zinc to reflect heat. The roof was designed to create constant air circulation. But the real genius was the shape. The pyramid design meant that as ice melted, the remaining ice would settle and compress, making it denser and slower to melt. A properly built icehouse could keep ice frozen from January to October. George Washington's icehouse at Mount Vernon held 75 tons of ice. It required 30 slaves working for 2 weeks every winter to fill it. The ice was harvested from the Potomac River, but only when it was exactly 4 inches thick. Thinner would melt too fast. Thicker was too dangerous to harvest. The enslaved workers would stand waist-deep in freezing water for 12 hours a day, cutting ice with massive saws. Many developed hypothermia. Frostbite was so common that plantation owners budgeted for replacement workers each winter. Thomas Jefferson went even further. At Monticello, he built an ice house that was an engineering masterpiece, 16 feet deep, lined with stone, with a drainage system for meltwater. But filling it required something monstrous. Jefferson's overseer would wake enslaved workers at 2 a.m. on the coldest nights of winter. They had to harvest ice in complete darkness because sunlight would weaken it. Workers who fell through the ice were left to drown. Stopping to save them would mean losing the harvest window. The ice cream Jefferson served his guests was made by enslaved chef James Hemings, who Jefferson had sent to France to learn the technique. Hemings perfected a recipe that took 3 days to make, requiring constant stirring in shifts. The kitchen staff would work in rotation, stirring for hours until their hands were too damaged to continue. But here's something historians don't talk about. Making ice cream required more than just ice and technique. It required salt. Massive amounts of it. In the 1700s, salt was incredibly expensive. It was literally worth its weight in silver in some places. The amount of salt needed to make ice cream for a single dinner party cost more than a worker's annual salary. This created a black market for ice salt, salt that had been used for making ice cream and could be recovered and resold. But used salt was contaminated with cream, sugar, and often lead from the containers. People who bought cheap recycled salt often died from poisoning. The salt trade for ice cream became so lucrative that criminal organizations got involved. The salt wolves of Naples controlled the ice cream salt trade through violence. They would burn down shops that didn't buy from them. In 1743, they murdered 16 people in a single night over a salt territory dispute. But the real revolution came from an unexpected place: Persia. The Persians had been making something called sharbat for centuries, the origin of the word sherbet. But their method was completely different and far more advanced than anything in Europe. They used something called yakdan, ice pools, that created ice through evaporative cooling even in the desert. But for ice cream, they had another technique that seems impossible. Persian ice cream makers would bury containers of cream mixture in sand that had been cooled to near-freezing temperatures, using a combination of saltpeter and specific minerals found only in certain desert regions. The sand would maintain exact temperatures for hours. But here's the incredible part. They discovered that adding rosewater and saffron didn't just flavor the ice cream. These ingredients contained natural antifreeze proteins that prevented large ice crystals from forming. The result was ice cream smoother than anything Europe could produce. The Persian method required ice runners, young boys who would run relay style carrying ice cream containers from the cooling pits to customers, covering sometimes 20 miles in the desert heat. They had less than an hour before it melted. Many collapsed from heat exhaustion. Some died. In India, the Mughal emperors created the most elaborate ice cream system in history. They built the Himalayan Ice Road, a 300-mile route from the Himalayas to Delhi, with cooling stations every 10 miles. Runners called kumashwalas would carry 40-pound blocks of ice on their backs, running in shifts day and night. The journey took 48 hours. The mortality rate was staggering. For every successful delivery, 3 runners died on the route from exhaustion, altitude sickness, or avalanches. The ice that survived was used to make kulfi, a dense ice cream that required 12 hours of constant stirring. The Mughal emperors employed 500 people just for making ice cream. They had tasters who would sample each batch for poison, knowing that the lead and mercury often used in the freezing process could kill them. By the 1800s, ice cream had become an obsession that was destroying entire ecosystems. In America, ice harvesting had depleted most accessible sources. Companies started draining ponds and lakes completely to harvest the bottom ice, which was denser. The ecological damage was catastrophic. The Hudson River ice harvest of 1879 removed so much ice that it changed the river's temperature, killing millions of fish. Entire species went extinct because their spawning grounds were destroyed by ice harvesting. But the human cost was even worse. In 1888, the Great Ice Famine hit when a warm winter meant no ice harvest. Without ice, there was no refrigeration for medicine. Vaccines couldn't be stored. Thousands died from preventable diseases. The price of ice cream skyrocketed. In New York, ice cream cost more per ounce than gold. Ice cream parlors hired armed guards. There were ice cream riots in 3 major cities. 47 people died fighting over access to ice cream vendors. The invention of mechanical refrigeration in 1851 should have ended this madness. But it didn't. Because artificial freezing couldn't replicate the texture of naturally frozen ice cream. The ice crystals were different. The taste was wrong. Elite establishments continued using natural ice until the 1920s. The last commercial ice harvest in America was in 1926. Workers who had spent their lives harvesting ice suddenly had no purpose. Many committed suicide rather than face a world without their trade. But here's the most disturbing part of this entire history. We've lost something crucial. Modern ice cream, for all our technology, isn't as good as what they made 200 years ago. We've analyzed historical recipes, but we can't replicate them. The specific minerals in natural ice, the precise hand-stirring techniques, the exact pressure created by certain wooden paddles, all lost. In 2019, food scientists tried to recreate Thomas Jefferson's ice cream recipe exactly. They used the same ingredients, the same tools, even ice harvested from the same river. It didn't work. Something about the process, some crucial detail, has been forgotten. There are Italian families who claim to still know the original mantecatore techniques, but they refuse to share them. They say the knowledge is cursed, that everyone who learns the true method dies young. Maybe they're right, because when you look at the history of ice cream, it's written in blood and suffering. Every scoop represents someone who froze to death harvesting ice, someone who went blind from ammonia, someone who stirred until their hands were destroyed. We turned a simple pleasure into an industry of death. We destroyed ecosystems, enslaved thousands, and poisoned countless people, all for frozen cream and sugar. The next time you buy ice cream from a store freezer, remember, your ancestors literally died for this. They sacrificed their health, their sanity, and their lives so that nobles could eat flavored ice in summer. And the tragic irony? After all that suffering, all that ingenuity, all that death, we ended up with inferior ice cream. The democratic convenience of modern refrigeration gave us something that would make those ancient mantecatori weep. We gained convenience, but lost the art. We saved lives, but sacrificed quality. We democratized ice cream, but forgot what made it special. Some historians argue this was inevitable. Others say we chose the easy path over the right one. But everyone agrees on one thing. The golden age of ice cream is over, and it's never coming back. Because nobody today would be willing to pay the true price for perfect ice cream. Nobody would stir for 6 hours until their hands bled. Nobody would go blind from toxic fumes. Nobody would die harvesting ice from frozen rivers. And maybe that's for the best. Or maybe we've lost something irreplaceable. The willingness to suffer for perfection, to sacrifice for sweetness, to literally die for dessert. The ancient ice cream makers took their secrets to the grave. Perhaps they knew something we've forgotten. Some pleasures are worth any price. Or perhaps they were simply insane from the ammonia fumes. We'll never know.